right, so Nathan suggested that we share with you how we got involved in sharing social psych with the public. And for me, I would say it sort of started here. Before becoming a faculty member, my only real experience with gainful employment was as a water skiing instructor, which is not very lucrative. And so when I got my first real faculty job and my first real grown-up salary, I wondered what to do with my newfound wealth. Now, being a happiness researcher, I naturally turned to the literature on well-being, and I was very surprised to discover that while there were thousands of articles documenting the overall relationship between income and happiness, there were only a few strands of research examining how people should use their money in order to get the most happiness out of it. So really just driven by my own curiosity, I started doing research on this topic along with my collaborators, and it was really just kind of to my pleasant surprise that it turned out that other people were interested in this topic too, and our initial work got quite a bit of media attention. A New York Times reporter wrote a story on the work that went viral, and so I started getting all of these emails from agents and editors asking me if I'd be interested in writing a book. And like probably some of you in this room, I'd gotten a couple of those sorts of emails earlier in my career, so even as a postdoc, gotten some of these emails, but I felt like, I didn't want to write another book on happiness. And so it was really for the first time after doing this work on spending that I thought to myself, gosh, there's something I really want to say that hasn't been said before, kind of all in one place for a broad audience. And so that became our book, Happy Money, with my awesome co-author, Mike Norton. And so I imagine that some of you guys might be here in this room today in part because you're asking yourselves a similar question of, is it time? Do I maybe want to write a book? And so I would suggest that media articles can provide a great pilot test. So if you write an article or a journalist writes an article on your work, it provides an opportunity to see if other people, like beyond your own lab and beyond SPSP, are interested in the kind of work that you're doing. Perhaps even more importantly, if you can write the article yourself, it provides a great opportunity to see if you're interested, to see if you like doing the kind of writing that's entailed when you start communicating with a broader audience. Now, it turns out that actually books can be pretty short, so our book is like pamphlet length, and I was a little bit sheepish about this when we turned it in, but it turns out that publishers like short books, and so I think that a single scholarly review paper can potentially provide a nice foundation for a book. So if this is something you're thinking about doing, and you've maybe gotten some emails from agents and editors, it could be tempting to just go ahead and work with a particular editor who maybe emailed you and seems smart and interesting, but I would suggest that in fact, for us, it can be more advantageous to work with a literary agent. So agents are these amazing people who can actually get bidding wars going between major publishing houses for your book, even though nobody's ever heard of you. And that's important because that can shape the size of your advance. And in fact, I've read that most books don't make their advance back, so the size of your advance may determine all the money that you ever get, and an agent can help make the most of that. I think perhaps even more importantly, for me, I found that sort of stepping into this world of trade publishing was a little bit like transferring to a new high school where the social norms are just a little bit different than what I'm used to in our high school of social psychology and academia, and a good agent can help you to navigate those different social norms. Also, as some of my friends have kind of discovered the hard way, editors leave. So there's quite a bit of turnover in the publishing business. Your editor at Simon & Schuster might leave and go to Random House, and an agent can help to sort of see you through that process so that you don't get left in the lurch. Now, if you don't have agents banging down your door, that's okay. You could buy a list of agents on the internet, but please don't. These lists aren't very good, and instead you could just talk to colleagues and find out from colleagues who've written books who they've worked with. Also, it turns out most people thank their agent in the acknowledgement section, so if you just read the acknowledgement sections of books that you've liked, that provides you with a great set of names of people who are out there. Now, at some point along the way, you'll probably have to craft a book proposal. Book proposals can range all the way from being as little as 5 pages to being 30 pages or more. My personal opinion is that less is more. So research by George Lowenstein suggests that people will pay more for something if you make them curious about it. And in fact, the best way to provoke curiosity is to give people a little bit of information about something, but not too much. So you want to kind of whet their appetite without kind of filling them up. Now, if you should get a book deal, you will someday wake up and think to yourself, oh my God, I have to write a book. And if you find yourself in that situation, I would suggest that the best thing that you can do is to go away. So for me, I wrote the first chapter of our book by experiences in Barcelona. I went away for a writing retreat with some colleagues after the European Social Psych Conference. And I think that this is really helpful in allowing you to kind of, apparently Skype Wi-Fi is available for anybody who's interested. I think this is really helpful for enabling you to kind of step outside of the sort of mindsets that govern the kind of work that we do on a daily basis. So it can be really difficult, at least for me, and kind of as Dave Myers was suggesting, to kind of flip back and forth between, meetings with people and all the sort of other work that we're doing and trade writing. Now, if you can't go to Barcelona, that's okay, although it is a good excuse. But if you can't get away, I think having even like a day of the week that you set aside to just work on the book can be really, really helpful. And I say this again because I think the priorities that kind of come to the forefront when you're writing for a broad audience are a bit different than the priorities that we're used to emphasizing. So when I'm writing for a broad audience, I spend a lot of time trying to find, kind of as Dave suggested, the most vivid example or study that I can to illustrate an idea. I also spend a kind of embarrassing amount of time trying to make every sentence as interesting and clear as I possibly can, while also making sure that it's accurate. Now, I think sometimes, as Eli mentioned, we sort of perceive this trade-off between interest and accuracy. Like, if I want to make the article more interesting, I'm going to have to make it less accurate. And of course, there's a grain of truth to this, right? We can't have all of the caveats and stuff that we might like in science land when we were communicating with that broader audience. But I would suggest that this is a problematic metaphor. And that instead, we should think about our good old 2x2. So the bread and butter 2x2 of social psychology tells us that we could create a fully crossed design. And I would suggest that we should think of interest level and accuracy level as being fully crossed, and that when we write for a broad audience, we really need to strive to be in that green box where both are high. And actually, one of the things I've been most pleasantly surprised to discover in writing for top media outlets like the New York Times is that good media outlets care about both of these dimensions. So I have been kind of blown away by the quality of the fact checkers at the New York Times. These are amazing people who comb through every sentence that you write to make sure that it is perfectly accurate. And that's a level of attention to detail that, of course, you're not going to get at journals with overworked reviewers. Now, at the same time, I think the really remarkable thing about the New York Times is that people like reading it. People read the New York Times for pleasure. I think this is a less common response to JPSP. But I don't think that it has to be that way. So the writing that I've done for a broad audience has actually changed the writing that I do for academic audiences. So it kind of seems to me like, well, why not make my academic writing vivid, interesting, and clear as well as accurate? And this seems like it should be so uncontroversial that it would be a boring thing to say in a large room. But in fact, I've actually gotten some interesting pushback on this from editors. So for example, in a recent decision letter, the editor wrote, "At times, the writing is a little too informal and colloquial or too novelish/journalistic. Please use a more academic/scientific style throughout the paper." Now, I get this. I understand this response, right? We're used to seeing stiff writing and rigorous scientific methods go together, but they don't have to, right? And I think we should rip them apart and go ahead and describe rigorous scientific studies in vivid, interesting, and clear ways. And if you're interested in doing that, if you're interested in turning that sort of turgid academic prose into more clear, engaging writing, I highly recommend that same book. Oops, sorry. That Dave mentioned, The Sense of Style by Steve Pinker. It's kind of like extreme makeover for academic writing. And I think it's a really, really helpful tool in shifting the way that we write. Now, as well as changing the way that I write about science, I think that the work that I've done communicating research with a broader audience has actually affected the way that I do science. So now if my lab is planning sort of a multi-study package for a paper, we'll think about, let's make sure we include in there at least one study that's really vivid and engaging, that makes a good story, that's kind of sticky. So for example, when we first started doing work on pro-social spending, we conducted a study in which we handed out cash. So we walked up to people in the morning and literally gave them either a $5 or a $20 bill that we asked them to spend by the end of the day on either themselves or somebody else. Now, since that time, we've done lots and lots of other studies with additional controls, often in the lab, but this is the study that almost always gets cited in both the scholarly and popular literature, and I think the reason is that it's clear and engaging and it makes a good story. Now, that said, I think with the current climate in our field, sometimes when we see an interesting finding or like a cool, sexy study, it makes us worry that there must be something wrong with it. Again, I think this stems from this kind of bad metaphor of the seesaw between interest and accuracy. But at the same time, I think it means that those of us who are choosing to share our work with a broader audience perhaps have a heightened responsibility to make sure that we're modeling the current best practices in our field. So for example, my lab has changed all of our consent forms so that we can post all of our data on the open science framework. So I think when we communicate with a broader audience, it should push us to embody the best practices in our own field. At the same time, I think it can actually help us to get beyond some of the not so great things in our field. So I think a limitation within social psychology is that we often tend to rely heavily on North American samples, particularly psychology undergraduates. And my initial work with my collaborators on pro-social spending certainly was guilty of that. We conducted it entirely in North America. And it was actually interacting with journalists who kept asking us, yeah, but are these results going to generalize to other places where people don't have so much disposable income? It was those questions that actually spurred us to go to the trouble of conducting parallel experiments in places like South Africa and Uganda and India to see if we could get the same effects in both poor and rich countries. So in my experience, I think communicating our science with a broader audience can kind of push us to take our research to new places, both literally and figuratively, potentially enriching our science. Thank you.